Good morning. Hope you are glad to be here. I'm certainly glad to be here with all of you. And really, as it's happened many times, I have appreciated these opportunities lately to be able to study, to present something. It's good for me. I like the Bible study that way. It gives me a goal and a purpose, and I don't wander as much. And I appreciate that. So thank you for encouraging us to do that. This evening, I think Brian Cooper's preaching. So if you could be back here this evening, I'm sure he would find that to be an encouragement, and it would be a benefit, I'm sure, to you as well. He does a good job and takes these things seriously. The other thing I've found is that if we just listen to what has already been said, what's already been sung, we could maybe talk for one more minute and we'd all be done. But I'm not going to do that for you. It'll be longer than that. The theme this morning may be just about the most self-centered theme that you may ever hear me preach on, in that I'm not asking you to do anything for anybody else in most of this lesson. I'm only going to be asking you to look at what God's Word says about what you can do. You have the ability to do what you should do for yourself, if that makes any sense. Thank you, Joseph, for reading 1 Samuel 30, 1 through 6 for me earlier. I appreciate you doing that. If you would all turn, we're going to come back here once or twice, but if you would go ahead and turn to 1 Samuel 30, we'll read verses 1 through 6 again, and then you'll have heard it twice, and may be more likely to be remembered later. It starts out saying, "Then it happened when David and his men came to Ziklag on the third day that the Amalekites had made a raid on the Negev and on Ziklag, and had overthrown Ziklag and burned it with fire. And they took captive the women and all who were in it, both small and great, without killing anyone, and carried them off and went their way. When David and his men came to the city, behold, it was burned with fire, and their wives and their sons and their daughters had been taken captive. Then David and the people who were with him lifted their voices and wept until there was no strength in them to weep. Now David's two wives had been taken captive, Ahinoam the Jezreelitess and Abigail the widow of Nabal the Carmelite. Moreover, David was greatly distressed because the people spoke of stoning him, for all the people were embittered, each one because of his sons and his daughters. But David strengthened himself in the Lord his God." This 1 Samuel 30, verse 6, there right at the end. But David strengthened himself in the Lord his God. If you have the original, not original, but the older version, the King James Version, not the New King James Version, most of all the other translations that I saw more or less did it the way that the New American Standard said there at the top of your screen. But David strengthened himself in the Lord his God. King James actually translated that, but David encouraged himself in the Lord his God, right? We're not talking about exercise. We're not talking about curls or bench pressing, right? We're talking about something mentally and in his heart, in his faith that David did. He encouraged himself in the Lord his God. We're going to talk about 4 examples, and all of these are going to relate to us individually. 4 examples out of the Bible of people who did something similar, who did this thing. They encouraged themselves, and what they did, where they strengthened themselves. Hannah, in the beginning of Samuel, we're going to look at, has to do with her health. Paul and Silas with their circumstances. David, we're going to come back here towards the end with people, and then we're going to talk about Jesus and how he actually had all of these things fail him at one time or another, the health, circumstances, and people, and we're going to look and see what he did. Before, I mentioned self-centered. This is not what I had in mind when I said that, but I want to tell you really quickly. I think I mentioned my grandfather before. Evidently, it meant more to me than I thought, because I think this is the second time I've mentioned it in front of you all. But when I was a kid, my grandfather had a granny and granddad, okay? That's what we called my grandmother. I don't know what you called yours. We called ours granny, and this is terrible pictures, especially the 2 funny-looking kids in there. But the granny would be on your right, I think, your left, and granddad there with my brother and I on the right-hand side. And that was how I mostly remember them. That was an outdoor park of some kind, state park. That's him on the far left. There's a young man with, again, a funny-looking guy to his right there, his left, I guess, your right. That was me in my early teens, and then granddad there on the far side, and that's kind of how I remembered him. My favorite thing about my memory of Granddad was he pretty much let us do any wild boy thing that we wanted to do. My parents were not that way. They were okay. But we got to shoot BB guns. We got to hunt even if we wanted to. We didn't do a lot of hunting. He always had rubber band guns for us when we went over there made. We could shoot big, huge rubber bands he made out of tractor tires. We could shoot them at each other. Slingshots he would make, and we could hit just about anything with a slingshot. We were boys when we were at Granddad's house, and he would let us do that. But one of the things he enjoyed most, and these kids are not related to us anyway, but those tires, he worked on tractor tires, repairing them, and he would have these, as he replaced them, he would take them back to the shop and patch them and give them to us. They had stems in them about this long. You could poke your eye right out with them, but nobody cared. And we would stack them on the lake. We would jump on them. We would get inside. We'd roll down the hills. It was crazy. And he took great joy in doing that for us. He thought it was wonderful. And the thing I want to mention about him was that was somewhat uncharacteristic of Granddad, because he was a quiet man. That made him sound like a wild guy. He was not out there shooting things with us with the slingshots or the rubber band guns. He would show us how it worked. He would show us that he could do it, but then he would go sit on the porch, okay? And we'd go run around just breaking anything we wanted to break, really. And but he was a fairly quiet guy. We walked through the woods, and he would know, trees and by the bark or the leaf, by the fruit, whatever it was. It didn't matter if it was wintertime, if it was summertime. He knew what kind of tree it was. He knew the birds. We could ask him. But he wouldn't come out and say, hey, guys, look at what I know. He would never do that. If you were walking through the woods and you pointed at something, you say, hey, Granddad, what's that? And he'd say, oh, well, that's a blue jay. That's an easy one. But I didn't retain all this. Don't get me wrong. But it was an interesting guy. That he was quiet. He was smart. He was a member of Mensa. I think that used to mean something. I don't know if it still does anymore. He was a smart man, but very, very quiet. Kind of kept to himself. My dad described him as being stoic when he was young. Stoic. He was not a effusive man. He wasn't a very emotional type of guy. And my grandmother, Granny, she was kind of mean. Just saying. She was tough as nails, and she would say whatever was on her mind. And Granddad would go out in the garage, no air conditioning, no heat, to his office, just I think get away from her sometimes. That was the kind of what they were like. But they'd been married a long time, had 4 boys. We saw him about once a month during my early teen years, and during one of those visits, he came to Red Lobster, and I think I mentioned this before. I thought of that this morning. I probably should have used another example, but he couldn't use his right hand. He was eating with his left hand, and my dad said, "Pop, why are you eating with your left hand? All the food's falling on the plate and off the plate." And Granddad said, "Well, I woke up today and I couldn't use my right arm, and I knew we were meeting for lunch, and so I didn't want to miss it. We only see you about once a month, and so I didn't want to miss it, and so that's why I'm doing this." And they took him to the hospital. He was dead a few weeks later from brain cancer, but he didn't want to miss lunch with us. And so when I think of Granddad, I describe him that way because there are different perspectives to have about everything, right? We all have our own perspective. My dad described my grandfather at his funeral in front of his 4 brothers, in front of maybe 40 of us in the family. Dad was the only one that was particularly religious, and so they asked him to say something. This was the kind of private time you have as a family beforehand. The people that came from all over the little town for the cemetery, for the burial, was hundreds and hundreds of cars. It was the biggest event I'd ever been at, other than like a rock concert, I think, at the time. And this was a little tiny town. But again, he'd worked for all these people, all their farms, all this community for 40 years. But if you'll notice up there, the best thing my father could think to say in 1 Thessalonians 4 came down a little ways. It says that you also aspire to lead a quiet life. This is what he read for his brothers, that you also aspire to lead a quiet life, to mind your own business and to work with your own hands as we commanded you, that you may walk properly towards those who are outside, that you may lack nothing. That was the best definition my dad could give, in hopes that somehow my father was Christian, because they'd only talked about it one time. And Granddad had said he believed the Bible, believed in God, and he didn't really want to talk about it. And that was it. I have no idea what his personal beliefs may have held. He was just a quiet man. So that's how Dad described him, I think, as a way of trying to turn his brothers' minds and the family's minds towards something scriptural, and to say something that could be said nice about my grandfather. So, perspectives on this. If you think about it, we all have things in our lives we all have to deal with. Here was death. We here, and I could have used something much more personal than my grandfather, who died way back when I was 16 years old. We know people together here in this congregation that have died, who have suffered. We know people here who have had loss. They've lost their spouse, they've lost children, they have lost just about everything there is to lose. Someone in this room has lost it. And there are different perspectives on that. My grandfather had to face death in a few weeks. That's a scary thing, I'm imagining. I imagine that he had concerns. I imagine that he feared for his family or his wife of so many years as to what that might do for her or to her. You had Granny, lost a husband, lost a spouse, a father of her children, the caretaker of the house, the man who paid the bills and did so many things and defended her when people spoke negatively of her because she was mean. And I wasn't going to say that. His whole family just about disowned him because he married her. That was the story. That's how odd a situation that was. But what about the perspective of the 4 sons? Even among those sons, my dad had one perspective and the other 3 sons had a different perspective on this loss, this tragedy. 10 grandchildren, various ages, 2 to about 20, I think. I think I was 16 at the time. 4 daughter-in-laws. You had friends. They would have thought about this differently. They didn't lose a family member. They lost a friend. We've lost friends. Acquaintances. I mentioned so many people that showed up at the funeral that probably maybe didn't know him at all. Doctors. Doctors see death and loss and illness every single day. They saw exactly the same tragedy that my grandfather went through. They saw it as part of their job. I'm sure that they felt for him and the family, but it wouldn't have affected them the way it affected Granny or the way it affected his children or grandchildren, or certainly not as it affected Granddad. And then you had people that didn't know him at all. A second ago, you didn't know him at all. You still don't really know him. But perhaps just that perspective change, having seen a picture, knowing he meant something to me, that loss from the world somehow, knowing that we don't really know, that we probably can assume the status of his eternal soul. Hopefully that might mean something to you. At the same time, it's no impact. You can go to lunch later on today and forget about it. But what I say about it is that when we go through struggles, when we go through loss, when we go through tough times, when we have tragedy, when we have difficult, discouraging times, our perspectives are our own. They're our own. Our perspective, my perspective on my life is constant. That's it. I see things through my eyes. I can attempt to see them through your eyes, but that's just an attempt. That's my perspective of your perspective, if that makes any sense. My suffering is my own. My strengths and my times of conquering are my own. They're all my perspective. And in fact, my perspective of that same event can be totally, totally different than anybody else's. And who knows the truth other than God? Because that's the other perspective that matters every single day, every single second. It too is constant in your life. God's perspective not only is constant, it's eternal. His perspective is better than my perspective. His perspective is better than your perspective. It's complete. My perspective is incomplete, and I will never be able to convey that accurately to anyone else, even if we go through the same circumstances. But God knows. God knows my perspective. God knows my baggage. God knows my experiences. So let's consider this as we go to strengthen ourselves in the Lord our God. One thing I want to point out before we go to some other examples, if you look at that word, but David strengthened himself in the Lord his God. There's 2 things. One is that word strengthened, that's an intentional thing, okay? This is not an accidental thing. This is not, well, he was running, and the more he ran every day, the stronger he got. That's not, he meant to do this. He intentionally strengthened himself. The second thing is that it implies that it wasn't new. It's something that's done over a period of time. Clearly, the context here wasn't over a very long period of time, but this idea that he strengthened himself isn't that he went and prayed, he felt better. This was something that evidently David was used to doing, and we're going to talk about that a little later on. The most important part about this to remember is that last part of that sentence, in the Lord his God, in the Lord. And we'll continue to dwell upon that. I hope everyone understands that. If you would, let's, with 4 examples, Hannah, Paul and Silas, David and Jesus, all of these people we're going to look at. We can look at a lot more. There's a lot of people in the Bible, once you start thinking about this, that took steps on their own behalf to strengthen themselves in the Lord. But we're just going to look at these 4. Hannah, 1 Samuel. If you want to stay in 1 Samuel, go all the way back to the beginning, chapter 1. We're going to read a number of verses there. 4 through 20. 4 through 20. When the day came that Elkanah sacrificed, he would give portions to Peninnah his wife and to all her sons and her daughters. But to Hannah he would give a double portion, for he loved Hannah. But the Lord had closed her womb. Her rival, however, would provoke her bitterly to irritate her, because the Lord had closed her womb. It happened year after year. As often as she went up to the house of the Lord, she would provoke her. That's provoke Hannah. So she wept and would not eat. Then Elkanah, her husband, said to her, Hannah, why do you weep? And why do you not eat? And why is your heart sad? Am I not better to you than 10 sons? Then Hannah rose after eating and drinking in Shiloh. Now Eli the priest was sitting on the seat of the doorpost of the temple of the Lord. She was greatly distressed, prayed to the Lord, and wept bitterly. She made a vow and said, O Lord of hosts, if you will indeed look on the affliction of your maidservant and remember me and not forget your maidservant, but will give your maidservant a son, then I will give him to the Lord all the days of his life, and a razor shall never come on his head. Now it came about as she continued praying before the Lord that Eli was watching her mouth. As for Hannah, she was speaking in her heart. Only her lips were moving, but her voice was not heard, so Eli thought she was drunk. And Eli said to her, How long will you make yourself drunk? Put away your wine from you. But Hannah replied, No, my Lord, I am a woman oppressed in spirit. I have drunk neither wine nor strong drink, but I have poured out my soul before the Lord. Do not consider your maidservant as a worthless woman, for I have spoken until now of my great concern and provocation. Then Eli answered and said, Go in peace, and may the God of Israel grant your petition that you have asked of him. She said, Let your maidservant find favor in your sight. So the woman, Hannah, went her way and ate, and her face was no longer sad. Then they arose early in the morning and worshiped before the Lord and returned again to their house in Ramah. And Elkanah had relations with Hannah his wife, and the Lord remembered her. It came about in due time, after Hannah had conceived, that she gave birth to a son, and she named him Samuel, saying, Because I have asked him of the Lord. So some things to point out here. If you go up to, well, actually, let's consider for a second before we even do that. This idea, we're relating this to health. Is there anything quite as sad as a woman who desperately wants to be a mom, whose body has failed her in that? Her health, for whatever reason, her body is not working correctly, and she cannot be a mom. I'm not implying that every woman should want to be a mom. I'm not saying that. I'm not saying that it's something somehow you're incomplete if you can't. I'm not saying that. But what I'm saying is, surely by experience, you have seen someone who has become a total wreck, a couple that has become a total wreck, leading who knows where because of this desperation that can be seen in a woman who desperately wants to be a mom, whose body does not work in that way and is unable to do that. There are things she could do. We could adopt. We have a number of people here that have adopted. My sister was adopted. It's like somebody chose you out of a circumstance and made you their own. That is an amazing, amazing, amazing thing for anyone to be adopted. But for the mother who wants to be a mom with her own child, it's a traumatic, stressful, awful event. I've seen it many times. I had a receptionist that was that way for a while, and it was so, so sad. There was no hiding the fact that she was so sad. I have a business partner who fought for years and years, spent lots and lots of money trying to have his wife be the mother of the child. Not because they didn't believe in adoption, but because something in her said that she needed this. It's sad. And yet while we can see and recognize how sad that is, this health condition that Hannah has, this health condition that others have, we never really understand it for ourselves. I have no idea what it means to want to be a mom. I don't hardly want to be a dad someday. I'm just kidding. Just kidding. There's my daughter's over there. I'm just kidding. But it's traumatic. Well, the same thing could be said for someone who has faced cancer, we have people who have faced cancer, someone who has faced an amputation of some kind or a debilitating disease of any kind. We can sort of understand that it's terribly stressful, but we don't really understand what they brought to the table and are going through. Have you ever noticed that some people face terrible health circumstances and they're happy, they're fine, there's a smile on their face, they're encouraged somehow, and that's what we're talking about, is what's the difference between that person who might be upbeat and optimistic and happy and strong, and yet that's not what she was here. Let's see what she was. It said that in verse 4, let's see, in verse 6, her rival would provoke her bitterly to irritate her. can't imagine making fun of somebody because they have a health issue, a problem, something that's really sorrowful to them. And here's somebody that's poking fun at her over and over. And it happened, it said in verse 7, year after year. This was not, she went to the temple once, prayed to God, and God gave her a child. Year after year after year, she went and was sad. She did not have a child. Her body did not work correctly. Her health had failed her in this. And as often she went up to the Lord, it says she would provoke her, so she wept and would not eat. I think pretty much every guy in the world understands verse 8 better than every woman in the world, okay? Yeah, he didn't get it. He has no idea. Verse 8 says, Elkanah said, well, Hannah, let me give you a reason why you should be able to be okay. Aren't I better? Let me just tell you, it's okay. You'll be fine. There are options for you. And that did not help. He said, obviously she's weeping. Obviously her heart's sad. And he didn't understand her perspective, or at least he didn't express it very well. Verse 10, she was greatly distressed. Verse 15, she was oppressed in spirit. She was pouring out her soul. But what were the steps that she took? What, on this theme of strengthening herself in the Lord, what did she do? She still, year after year, she went to the temple. She did not avoid the things that she was supposed to do, did she? I imagine that could be very discouraging, to go to God knowing that God could fix this, year after year knowing that God chose not to. I'm certain that that would be potentially depressing instead of encouraging. And yet she took steps. She went year after year. She did what she was supposed to do. She went as close physically as she could really to God. And while she was there, she intentionally, even though distressed, verse 10, prayed to the Lord. Prayed while she wept bitterly. She prayed to the Lord. Why? Was she just praying for a child? Or was she praying just to communicate her sadness? In verse 12, she continued praying before the Lord. In verse 15, I have poured out my soul before the Lord. Now we know in this that Eli was there. He didn't get it at first either. I guess that's pretty common. That's those perspectives. His perspective was different than her perspective. But he eventually got it, and he was able to encourage her somewhat. But do you think that what he said was what encouraged her as much as it says that let your maidservant find favor in your sight? So she went her way and ate, and her face was no longer sad. Had she not gone to the temple, had she not prayed, had she not been praying fervently, it wouldn't have mattered because he would not have noticed her there. But who knows? This was about what she had done. She took steps, and God did not fail her. Eventually, she gave birth to a son, and specifically said, because I have asked him of the Lord. And then later on, she honors what she had said and gave the child back to God to serve in the temple. So that's Hannah. Her health failed her. Your health, my health, will fail us. But God will not fail us. It may seem that way year after year after year. It could seem that way. But God will not fail us. Let's look at the next example, Paul and Silas. Acts 16. If you could turn over there. Acts 16. 17 through 36. It's pretty long, but we're going to read it all. It happened as that we were going to the place of prayer. A slave girl having a spirit of divination met us, who was bringing her masters much profit by fortune telling. Following after Paul and us, she kept crying out, saying, these men are bondservants of the Most High God, who are proclaiming to you the way of salvation. She continued doing this for many days, but Paul was greatly annoyed and turned and said to the spirit, I command you in the name of Jesus Christ to come out of her. And it came out of her at that very moment. But when her masters saw that their hope of profit was gone, they seized Paul and Silas and dragged them into the marketplace before the authorities. And when they had brought them to the chief magistrates, they said, these men are throwing our city into confusion, being Jews, and are proclaiming customs which it is not lawful for us to accept or to observe, being Romans. The crowd, this verse 22, the crowd rose up together against them, and the chief magistrates tore their clothes off of them, tore Paul and Silas's clothes off of them, and proceeded to order them to be beaten with rods. And when they had struck them with many blows, they threw them into prison, commanding the jailer to guard them securely. And he, having received such a command, threw them into the inner prison and fastened their feet in the stocks. Let's stop right there just for a second and appreciate where we are. They were doing good things. They were doing things they were supposed to be doing. They even helped this girl, had a demon, had a spirit of some kind in her, and said, hey, come on out. In the name of Jesus, come out. They helped her. And what did they get for all their troubles? Their circumstances failed them completely. Their circumstances failed them. And they were doing what they thought they should. They were doing what they actually should be doing. There's no thinking about it, I guess. They were doing what they should do. They end up having their clothes stripped off of them, being beaten by rods many times, thrown into prison, and put their feet into stocks. I've never been beaten by rods. I've never been shamed publicly that I know of, to my face anyway. And they're shamed, they're beaten, they're put in there. Their circumstances failed them. And what does it say in verse 25? But about midnight, Paul and Silas were praying and singing hymns of praise to God, and the prisoners were listening to them. They were strengthening themselves in the Lord. It doesn't say the prisoners were joining in. It doesn't say the prisoners were partaking. I guess you really wouldn't have much choice but to listen to them if you're in prison, right? And they're singing and they're praying. Why were they singing and praying? Was this new to them? They were strengthening themselves in the Lord. And suddenly there was a great earthquake, so the foundations of the prison and the house were shaken, and immediately all the doors were open and everyone's chains were unfastened. When the jailer awoke and saw the prison doors open, he drew his sword and was about to kill himself, supposing that the prisoners had escaped. But Paul cried out with a loud voice, saying, "Do not harm yourself, for we are all here." And the story continues that the jailer and his family believed, and they were baptized. And that they bound up, they helped with their wounds, and that they, in verse 34, they greatly rejoiced and believed in God. And in verse 35 it says, "Now when the day came, the chief magistrates sent their policemen, saying, 'Release these men.' And the jailer reported these words to Paul, saying, 'The chief magistrates have sent to release you. Therefore come out now and go in peace.'" Now we're also told that Paul made them come and tell him himself, which is fine. But the idea being that Paul and Silas' circumstance failed them completely. Completely. They found themselves in jail, and yet they prayed intentionally. They sang intentionally to praise God for themselves together. We have spouses, we have friends. They may not understand our circumstances, but we can strengthen ourselves together as well. And that's what they were doing. They were strengthening themselves. And their circumstances failed them, but God did not fail them. God did not fail them. Oh, I want to look at Philippians 4 through 9. And see what Paul says here. Philippians 4 through 9. "Rejoice in the Lord always. Again, I will say rejoice. Let your gentle spirit be known to all men. The Lord is near. Be anxious for nothing, but in everything by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God. And the peace of God, which surpasses all comprehension, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. Finally, brethren, whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is right, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is of good repute, if there is any excellence and if anything be worthy of praise, dwell on these things, the things you have learned and received and heard and seen in me. Practice these things, and the God of peace will be with you." What is he saying? During times, bad times, doesn't matter what times, rejoice in the Lord always. The Lord is near. Don't be anxious. Intentionally pray. Give supplication with thanksgiving. Make those requests to God. And what will happen? You'll be strengthened. The peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, all comprehension. I have no idea why it works, right? We have no idea how the peace of God acts on us, or how it can be so big, or how it can be so potent. We don't understand the peace of God. It surpasses all understanding. It will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. You can strengthen yourself in the Lord your God and in Christ Jesus. So dwell on these things. David, let's go back to David. Back to 1 Samuel. We'll go through it. We've read it already. It's interesting when you think about these people that were probably such good admirers of David, right? Followers of David. I imagine they looked up to him. They went into battle behind David. They followed David. But when you look at verse 4, after all of their wives and their children and their sons, daughters, family, everybody had been taken captive, and they lifted up their voices and wept until no strength in them was left to weep. David was among that, right? This was traumatic. This was stressful. What's their first reaction? I think this is kind of probably normal. They turn around and they blame David, don't they? I don't know that that's unusual, that we have terrible things happen in our life. We have a bad circumstance. And what's one of the temptations we're going to have? We talked about this in our class this morning in middle school. We're going to blame somebody. And this is really easy to do. And unfortunately, it seems kind of natural. If I'm going through a bad circumstance, I could take it out on somebody else in a heartbeat. And that we all need to look about that. But so David, in verse 6, David was greatly distressed because the people spoke of stoning him, for all the people were embittered. But David strengthened himself. He strengthened himself. How do you react to tragedy? Well, David is pretty clear. He has something terrible going on, stressful going on. Was this new to David? Was this something that he said, hey, I'll try this? I would submit to you that no, it comes from habit. It comes from intentionally doing these things over time. Let's look over at Psalms. And it was when I was doing this, it turned out I couldn't hardly look at a psalm without it proving what I was kind of saying. I was in about 28, but I think we'll start at Psalm 23rd Psalm. That's a good enough place to start. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He does these things. What does he do? He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside quiet waters. He restores my soul. He guides me in the path of righteousness for his name's sake. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I'll fear no evil. But let's jump ahead in chapter 24. The earth is the Lord's and all it contains, the world and those who dwell in it. For he has founded it upon the seas and established it with the rivers. Who may ascend into the hill of the Lord, and who may stand in his holy place? Go down to the next chapter there, 25. To you, O Lord, I lift up my soul. O my God, in you I trust. Do not let me be ashamed. Do not let my enemies exult over me. Later on in that one, down about verse 12. Who's the man who fears the Lord? He will instruct him in the way he should choose. His soul will abide in prosperity. His descendants will inherit the land. He is strengthened over and over. He's proven. He writes, he sings, he prays to God when he's in times of distress and when he's not in distress. This is a habit he developed. Chapter 26, vindicate me, O Lord, for I have walked in my integrity. I have trusted in the Lord without wavering. Chapter 27, the Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear? The Lord is a defense of my life. Who shall I dread? Chapter 28, to you, O Lord, I call. My rock, do not be deaf to me. For if you are silent to me, I will become like those who go down to the pit. And then 28, verse 8 there. The Lord is their strength, the strength of their people. And he is a saving defense to his anointed. 29, the end of 29, verse 11. The Lord will give strength to his people. The Lord will bless his people with peace. Was it dependent on anybody other than David and God for David to be strengthened? Nope. That was it. David, God. Doesn't say anything about someone came and ministered to David. He had, I don't know about this time, he had plenty of people that could have ministered to him. He had plenty of people that could maybe have come and encouraged him. Had he gone and sought, later in life especially, sought them out. And here he's basically alone, I guess. He's alone and he's got God. But later in life, when he wrote many of these Psalms, he had wives, he had concubines, he had servants, he had all sorts of stuff. What does he go to? Him and God. How is he strengthened? Him and God. People will fail you. They failed David. The Lord will not fail you. The last example, Jesus. Let's look at Matthew 26. I was so happy to hear some of the reading this morning that Ben did, and the songs that we sang had to do with strengthening ourselves, but also with Jesus and what he went through in the garden. Let's touch on that just a little bit. Matthew 26. Let's think about, we probably don't have time to read a massive amount of this. We'll read some of it. But think about verse 26. Here they are together. Jesus knows he's getting ready to face a lot of suffering, a lot of difficulty, a lot of hardships, terrible amount, more than anyone here I think has probably ever encountered. And what does he do? He makes time for the Passover. Days in advance, he sends people out. He tells them where the room's going to be. He says, we're going to be together. That's one of the things that he prioritized, obviously. He instituted the Lord's Supper there. Obviously, he wanted to do that. But think about, maybe, just maybe, this was a time they could be together and sort of some time together be appreciated. Some of the time they were together probably wasn't. They had the bad news about Judas and some other things, but we can do that too. I can sit here in my little seat over there, and sometimes I can look around and go, you know what, it's good to be with God's people. It's good to be here together. I can do that on my own, even if nobody looks at me and says, hey, Matt, good to be here. We do that too. But I can do that from my seat. Hopefully you do that sometimes. Say, it's good to be here. Good to be worshiping with God's people. He goes on from there, though. He institutes the Lord's Supper. And verse 30, after singing a hymn, they went out to the Mount of Olives. One of the things that Paul and Silas did, they were singing, right? We sing here now. Can that help strengthen us? It can. It's nice to think about Jesus himself singing. And he went to the Mount of Olives, and Jesus said to them, you will all fall away before me this night, for it is written, I will strike down the shepherd, and the sheep of the flock shall be scattered. And Peter didn't believe him, did he? He said, even though all may fail, verse 33, all may fall away because of you, I will never fall away. I will never fail you. That's what he said, wasn't it? I will never fall away. We know that eventually he did, and Christ told him there that this very night you will deny me 3 times. Peter says, even if I have to die with you, in verse 35, I will not deny you. And all the disciples said the same thing too. Jesus came with them to a place called Gethsemane and said to his disciples, sit here while I go over there and pray. And he took with him Peter. Remember, he's going to have the most difficult thing he's ever had to face as a human here on earth. And just hours away. And what does he do? He says, sit here while I go over there and pray. And he took with him Peter and the 2 sons of Zebedee, and he began to be grieved and distressed. That sounds like some of the similar language that Hannah was going through, doesn't it? Then he said to them, my soul is deeply grieved to the point of death. Remain here and keep watch with me. And then he went off by himself. He had been with a bigger group. He narrowed it down to a smaller group, and then he went off by himself, just he and his Father. And he went a little further beyond them and fell on his face and prayed, saying, my Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me, yet not as I will, but as you will. Have you ever been in terrible circumstances where you prayed something similar? Oh, God, if you could just take this away, I would be so happy. If we could do this a different way. Can we do it a different way? Have you ever prayed that to God? But not as I will, but as you will. And he came to the disciples, and they failed him again. They found them sleeping and said to Peter, so you men could not keep watch with me for 1 hour? Keep watching and praying that you may not enter into temptation. What does he say to them? Keep watching, strengthen yourself that you may not enter into temptation. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. He went away again a second time and prayed, saying, my Father, if this cannot pass away until I drink it, unless I drink it, your will be done. Again he came and found them sleeping, for their eyes were heavy. And he left them again, himself and his Father, and went away and prayed a 3rd time, saying the same thing once more. And he came to the disciples and said to them, are you still sleeping and resting? Behold, the hour is at hand. And then the story continues. We know that Judas betrays him. Judas fails him. The system fails him. They turn him over to the religious system of the time, the government of the time in a way. And what happens? The circumstances fail him. Completely. No protection for Jesus. Nobody stepped up and said, this is wrong. The government did not say, no, we can't do this. This man's innocent. It failed him. And he even says, every day, this verse 55, I used to sit in the temple teaching you, and you did not seize me, but now all these things have taken place to fulfill the scriptures and the prophets. And the disciples left him and fled. And then we see Caiaphas and the high priest and the system fail him, down to about verse from 57 to 64. And then in verse 65, the high priest tore his robes and said, he's blasphemed. What further need do we have of witnesses? You've heard him blaspheme. And they said, he deserves death. Verse 67, and they spat in his face and beat him with their fists. And others slapped him. And they said, prophesy to us, you Christ, who is the one who hit you? So they mocked him. And then the little servant girl confronts Peter. And Peter gets confronted 3 different times. And each time, Peter fails Jesus. He doesn't fail him permanently. And I don't mean to imply that at all. But he certainly failed him right here, didn't he? He failed him. Circumstances failed him. Peter failed him. And Peter in verse 75 remembered the word which Jesus has said, before a rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times. And he went out and he wept bitterly. And they bound him and they took him to Pilate. Pilate essentially says, I don't find anything wrong with him. Again, everything failed him as far as the governor went and the government went. In verse 17, who do you want me to release for you, Barabbas or Jesus who is Christ? For he knew that because of envy they had handed him over. And what do the people say? Oh, give us the murderer. Give us the criminal. We'd rather have that guy than Jesus. His friends betrayed him, but his friends failed him. The system failed him. The circumstances failed him. All of these people that didn't really know him, they knew who he was, but they all failed him just ridiculously. And then, as they said in verse 23, crucify him. In verse 25, the people say, his blood be on us and our children. They released Barabbas for them. But after having Jesus scourged, he handed him over to be crucified. And the soldiers of the governor took Jesus into the praetorium and gathered the whole Roman cohort around him. They stripped him and put a scarlet robe on him. And after twisting together a crown of thorns, they put it on his head and a reed in his hand. In his right hand, they knelt down before him and mocked him, saying, Hail, King of the Jews. They spat on him and took the reed and began to beat him on the head. And after they had mocked him, they took the scarlet robe off of him and put his own garments back on him and led him away to crucify him. As they were coming out, what did they recognize? That after all of this strong man, Jesus Christ, had gone through the lashings, the beatings, and his health finally failed him. His health was not up to carrying his cross at this point. His health began to fail him. And they pressed Cyrene near Simon, named Simon, into service to bear his cross. And they took him to Golgotha. They gave him wine mixed with gall. Verse 35, and when they had crucified him, they divided up his garments among themselves by casting lots. And then they go on verse after verse. People made fun of him. People on the cross next to him made fun of him and mocked him. And then in verse 46, it had been read earlier, about the 9th hour, Jesus cried out with a loud voice, saying, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani. That is, my God, why have you forsaken me? Now let's think about that. Psalm 22. Clearly, Jesus is referring to Psalm 22. And I've heard all sorts of people give suppositions about what they think about this and what they think Jesus meant by it and what God may have done and what the darkness means and all this kind of stuff. But I tell you what, we can all see that right here, right now, God did not choose to pull Jesus off of that cross, did he? He left him there in his circumstances. He left him there with pain and death. He left him there with people that were mocking him and making fun of him. He leaves us in our circumstances sometimes, doesn't he? And we don't know why. We don't comprehend it. But it is the way it is supposed to be. Why? How do we know? Because God's perspective is eternal and perfect. He knows everything. And we know that he will not fail us. But right here, right then, Jesus was hanging there in sorrow, in sadness, in pain. And he was left there by God. But when the women came to see him the next day after he was buried, or a few days later after he was buried, let's go to chapter 28 and verse 5. The angel said to the women, do not be afraid, for I know who you are looking for, that you are looking for Jesus, who has been crucified. He is not here, for he is risen, just as he said. Come and see the place where he was lying. Go quickly and tell his disciples that he is risen from the dead. And behold, he is going ahead of you into Galilee. And they left the tomb quickly, it says. In verse 9, behold, Jesus met them and greeted them. And they came up and took hold of his feet and worshiped him. And Jesus said to them, do not be afraid. Go and take word to my brethren to leave for Galilee, and there they will see me. Let's skip down to verse 16. The 11 disciples proceeded to Galilee, to the mountain which Jesus had designated. When they saw him, they worshiped him, but some were doubtful. And Jesus came up and spoke to them, saying, all authority has been given to me in heaven and on earth. Go therefore and make disciples of all the nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all that I commanded you. And lo, I am with you always, even to the end of the age. Circumstances failed him. Health failed him. People failed Christ. He was left there by his own Father to hang and die on the cross. Do we compare to that at all? Who deserved, in the history of man, who deserved less to suffer than Jesus Christ? If you rated everybody, Jesus Christ as the top, boy, I'd be down here. Who deserves not to suffer? Christ, Mac Harder. And think about the little things that I think of as suffering compared to what Christ went through. Knowing that God will not fail me. I should not doubt. I should never doubt that. God will not fail me if I strengthen myself in him and I have faith in him and I follow his word, that even in life, if I am failed, so to speak, we know we have something to look forward to after death. too, don't we? Because Jesus will be with us to the end of the age, and we too have the ability to meet him in the sky one day, don't we? No matter what our suffering is here on earth or what we might have to face. He knows pain, he knows discouragement, and he will not fail us. We've been talking about 1 John in our middle school class, that in the beginning, it's very familiar, in the beginning was the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God, right? It says that all things were made through him, and without him nothing was made that was made. In him was the life, and that life was the light of men, and the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness doesn't comprehend it. And that's the way I feel a lot of the time. I have no idea how all that stuff works. I don't even recognize some days that light and that life and how they're tied together. But we know that God knows us, Jesus knows us better than anybody. None of us were created without him. Nothing was created without Jesus being there. And verse 14, he says that he became flesh and dwelt among us, and we saw the glories of the only begotten Father. And in him, Jesus was full of grace and truth. But that's an interesting combination, isn't it? Grace and truth. Trudy said just this last week something about truth without love. What was that? Truth without love can be a kind of a dictatorship or something like that. Anarchy. Truth is tough. Truth is difficult. Truth is suffering. And yet Jesus gave us the real truth too. The good truth too. But that grace, that Jesus knows us better than anybody knows us. His perspective is eternal and perfect, and he knows us. And he has grace for us if we decide to accept it. And that's what I would ask you today, that if you've never accepted that grace, if you've never accepted the idea of being strengthened by God eternally, maybe even just momentarily, and if you want that strength here, we can certainly help you with that. We're happy to pray with you if you need that. But at the same time, you have the ability to strengthen yourself in the Lord if you will do what he says. I think when Ben Walker was here weeks ago, he gave a list of about 20 things, something like that. We could all do every day to strengthen ourselves. We could read Scripture, we could memorize Scripture, we could pray more often, we could study with somebody. There's a big old long list. I've written it down, and I'm failing at it somewhat, but I am doing some of it, and I hope you are too, to strengthen yourself in the Lord. If any of this has touched your heart in such a way that you say, you know what, I'm not a Christian, and I would like to be a Christian. I would like to take advantage of the fact that Jesus died on the cross for my sins. I would like to be buried with him in baptism, to raise and be walked in newness of life. And walk in newness of life, my sins forgiven. We can do that for you right here and right now. And if you would like to know more about that, even if you don't come forward, we'd be happy to study with you. Please come forward while we stand and while we sing. Have thine